Now, in the previous module, we got started with this course. You got an overview of this course, and you also learned what exactly Django is and why you might want to consider using it. This course section is now all about setting up Django, so installing it, and creating Django projects in which we then can work so that we get up and running. Therefore, we're going to start by installing Django itself on our system. Then we're going to see how we can create brand new Django projects once Django is installed. And last but not least, we will also analyze a brand new Django project, because it turns out that we will get some default files and a default folder structure there. And we're going to dive into that and learn what Django created for us. Therefore, let's get started and let's dive right in. Now, Django is a Python framework. It's a framework that allows us to build web applications, websites with Python, and therefore the first setup step is that you got Python itself installed, the programming language. Now, for that, you can visit python.org, and then there you got multiple ways of getting started. For example, you can hover over documentation and click on the beginner's guide, which will also walk you through the installation. Or you scroll down a bit and go to download here and make sure that you download and install the latest version of Python. Python runs on all major operating systems, so you can and should install it on Windows, on Mac OS, whatever you are using. Now, for example, if you clicked here on this latest Python version, you can scroll down all the way to the bottom to find various installation methods for different operating systems. Now, I'm on Mac OS here, so I can simply download one of these installers here. On Windows, you could download one of those installers and simply download the installer and then walk through the installation process. Here, I'm doing this on Mac OS, so I'll quickly walk through that. Basically confirm all those defaults here and click install. Enter my password and then install Python on my system. Now, once this is installed, you can close this installer and then open your default terminal, bash, or command prompt on Mac OS, Linux, or Windows so that you can enter these commands here. And once you did that, you can type Python, and you should see the Python version being printed here, and you should enter this interactive mode. Now here on Mac OS, you see Python 2.7 in my case, because for Mac OS, there actually is a built-in Python version shipping together with Mac OS. And therefore here I even see the fix which I can run here. I need to run the Python 3 command. Now, this might not be the case for you, especially on Windows. So therefore, definitely try Python first. And if you then see the Python version which you installed, in my case, I installed Python 3.9 a couple of seconds ago, then you're fine. If you see a different version, as I'm doing it here, quit this process with Ctrl-D and instead type Python 3. And then you should see the version which you just installed. Now quit this process again with Ctrl-D, but now you know that you did install it correctly. Now that's Python installed. But of course, this is a Django course. So how do we now install Django? Well, Django is a Python package, a Python module, which we can install globally on our system. And that's important. Whilst Django also will be a framework which we use inside of a project, it also is installed as a global package to create new projects. That is something which I also mentioned before. Hence here, we now want to execute python 3-m pip to use the built-in pip module, which is the Python installer package basically, and then install Django. Now this will use this Python installer, the pip package, to install another global package, in this case the Django package. Now, Django will be a framework which we use inside of our to be created Django projects. And there it will help us with a lot of utility functionalities and so on, as you learned in the first course section. But Django also is a global tool, so to say, which we can install on our system to then create Django projects with it. So it's both. It's the framework which helps us in the project, but also a tool which creates such projects. And that's why we need to install it globally first, which we do with the pip install command from this pip Python module. So with python 3-m install Django, or just python-m, depending on your Python version, as I showed you a couple of seconds ago, you install Django. So if I now hit enter, this goes ahead, downloads Django onto my system, and installs it there as a global package. Now, once this is done, you can verify that it worked by running Django-admin. Type that into your command prompt or your terminal and hit enter. And you will see something like this, which might look like an error when you look at it briefly, but which actually proves that Django, the Django tool, was installed correctly. Because here it's basically telling you that just running Django admin like this is not supported, but that instead you need to specify a subcommand, and it then gives you a long list of available subcommands. Now we can ignore those for now, we just ran this to verify that it was installed correctly. If you don't see this, if you instead get an error like Django admin not found or unknown command, try closing your command prompt or terminal and reopen it. Also possibly restart your entire system and then try running this again. Also try installing Django again, of course. Ultimately, you should see this output here, and this proves that the Django tool was installed successfully. As a next step, we can now create a new Django project. Now, to create a brand new Django project, so a Python project which is configured to use Django to help us build websites, such a project can be created by running this Django admin command, which we briefly saw in action in the last course lecture, combined with the start project subcommand, and then a project name of your choice. For example, my page. But this project name is up to you. The first two parts are not. So let's run this command, and for this, first of all, navigate to a folder where you want to create this new project. Navigate to that folder here in your terminal or command prompt. You can navigate around with the cd command. So in my case, I will navigate to this Academine Pro folder in the teaching folder, in the development folder, which exists on my system. You can navigate to any other folder of your choice, for example, simply to the desktop or anything like that. If you're not sure how to navigate around with the cd command on Windows or on macOS or wherever you are, attached you'll find a resource that helps you with that. Now, once you navigated into that folder, you have the place where this new project should be created. So therefore here, I now run Django admin start project my page, or any name of your choice here, but I will stick to my page. Hit enter, and this will now seem like it didn't do anything, but actually it did create a new folder now in that folder into which you navigated. So in my case, there will be a new My Page folder, which was created in this Academine Pro folder. You can see it here. And this My Page folder now contains a manage.py file and then a subfolder with more Python files. Now that's nice to have, but I don't want to edit my code or my project here with the default Explorer or Finder and the default text editor. Therefore, instead, we want to set up a development environment. And that's what we're going to do next. So to work on our Python code, on our Django code, on this project we just created, we want to set up a development environment which is easy to use and which makes working on the code more fun and simply gives us as a developer an easier time. And for that, we need an IDE or a code editor. Now, you can use your favorite Python editor. For example, you could use PyCharm, but my recommendation is Visual Studio Code. Visual Studio Code is a free editor which is available for macOS, Windows, and Linux. And you can simply download it and install it from code.visualstudio.com. And the great thing about Visual Studio Code is that you can use it for Python, you can use it for HTML, for JavaScript, for CSS, for C++, for Java, whatever you want. You can edit basically any kind of code with it because it supports extensions, and you can install extensions to help you with your specific project. So in our case, we are going to look for extensions that help us with Python. So therefore, the first step is to download and install Visual Studio Code from code.visualstudio.com. But then as a second step, we're going to configure it. And we're going to install helpful extensions that help us with editing Python code. Now here I opened up Visual Studio Code, this IDE which I just installed, and it might look a little bit different for you because I already customized it a bit. Here under View, Appearance, you can control if you have a status bar at the bottom, for example, and I disabled it here for me. And you can play around with the appearance settings here to tweak it to look the way you want. In addition, I have this dark look, which you can also set if you want to by going to Preferences and then Color Theme. And here I'm using the Dark Plus theme. You can, of course, use any theme you want and use a light look or whatever you want. But I will stick to Dark Plus here. Now we want to work on the extensions that help us with editing code and help us with editing Python code specifically. For this, you should go to View, Extensions, or use the shortcut which you see here. And then there, I already have a bunch of extensions installed. Now I will name you the extensions you should install as well. And that would, for example, be the Python extension. Simply search the marketplace for Python and select this Python extension and then install it. Now, as I said, I already have it installed, but you just need to install it with one click. Now, once that is installed, there is another extension I recommend, and that's the Pylance extension. The Pylance extension also helps with Python development and gives you smart autocompletion, suggestions, and analyzes your code and is able to detect certain code errors. Now, both extensions are technically optional, but they will make your life as a Python developer a bit more convenient. And that's it. You don't need to install anything else, and therefore now you can go to View, Explorer, or use the shortcut and go back to this initial view. And now it's time to open our Python project. For this, I'll click on Open Folder here, and then simply open that project folder which we created a couple of seconds ago. In my case, this My Page folder, which I created with the Django admin command. Click Open, and this will load this project into the editor. Now I'm going to zoom a bit in so that this is all a bit bigger and easier to see. And you can, of course, adjust everything here the way you want by going to Code, Preferences, Settings, and playing around with the view settings here. Now, I will temporarily turn on my status bar because there I now want to ensure that we're using Python here and that this Python project is detected correctly. For this, I'll click on manage.py, this Python file. And now Visual Studio Code detects that I'm working on a Python project here. That's why it also opened up the Python extension documentation here. I will close that though. Now at the bottom left, it now picked one of my installed Python interpreters. And if you only have Python installed once on your system, there probably is a good chance that you have, then it should have picked the version you previously installed. Now I got multiple Python versions installed, and therefore I will click on this selected Python version down there, and then simply scroll to pick that Python version I installed a couple of minutes ago. In my case, Python 3.9. And this simply now makes sure that this Python version is used for evaluating and executing all that code here. Now with that, I'm going to close this status bar again. And now we got this selected. There also is a .vs Code folder which was created now. This folder simply saves some project-specific settings. In this case, it saves the Python interpreter which should be used. This is only relevant for VS Code, not for Django or Python. Now there's one other thing I want to do, and for that I will remove this empty line here, and then save this file, and now go to Code, Preferences, Keyboard Shortcuts, and there search for Format Document. Now this is a shortcut which will automatically reformat your code to make it easier to read. If it's not bound for you already, you can bind it now, otherwise you see the shortcut here. And if I now press this shortcut here, in this manage py file where I deleted this extra blank line, you should get this pop-up asking for AutoPAP8 to be installed. Maybe you're not getting it, for example, because you already have it installed, and that's of course then also fine. If you do get it though, press yes, and this will now install an extra extension for Python, which will be used by VS Code to format your code. You can then close this terminal which opened up and press the shortcut again, and it should now re-add this empty line, which proves that the installation works. And this is simply a little convenience which helps with formatting Python code and which keeps your code easy to read and follows the PAP8 styling guidelines, which are of course important styling guidelines for Python projects, totally independent of Django. You can learn more about PAP8 in a resource attached to this lecture if you're not sure what this is. Now, with all of that, we got our project set up. Now, I want to have a closer look at the actual Python files which were created here before we then finally can get started working on that code. So in this brand new Django project, we got a bunch of Python files. For example, we got the manage.py file. That's a file which already contains quite a lot of Python code. And it's also a file where we won't change anything. You should not touch this file. I guess we did touch it with this blank line, but you should not change the logic in this file. Because this is a file which we will use from time to time throughout this course to run project-specific commands. We ran Django admin before to create this project. Now inside of this project, to do certain things like starting a development server or setting up a database for our project, for these things, we will later use this manage.py file because this file will give us access to some built-in Django commands which we can use in any Django project. So we should not touch or edit this file. Now the interesting folder for us, therefore, is this my page folder. This now contains a couple of py files. Init py is not too interesting to us. It's empty and we don't really need to change anything here. It only exists to mark this folder and all the files in there as a Python module, a Python package, so to say. This is not a Django exclusive concept, and if you're not sure what Python modules and packages are, you might want to look this up, but it doesn't really matter to us here, so we can safely ignore the init file at the moment. Now the ASGI py file and the WSGI files, these files are also files which we won't really touch for the moment. They will become important later once we want to deploy our finished project onto a real server to expose it to the World Wide Web. For the moment, we don't need to do anything with these files. They will help us with serving our Python application in the end, and therefore these are important files which you of course also should not delete. You shouldn't delete any of these files, to be honest. Now we saw a bunch of files which don't matter. You might be asking yourself, where are the files that do matter? Where do we write our code? Well, for one, we're going to create a couple of files throughout this course, but two files which we also are allowed to edit are the settings.py and the urls.py files. Now, the settings file contains a bunch of global settings for this Django project. I will come back to this file from time to time when we need to tweak certain settings. In the end here, we can configure a lot of behaviors of our Django project, and we can fine-tune and tweak many aspects of Django with this file. Now, the great thing is that the default settings are quite okay, and therefore at the moment we don't need to change anything here, but we definitely will come back to this file from time to time to add more features or adjust certain behaviors. Now, the urls.py file, that is an important file once we start adding more and more pages to our web application, so to say. Because here we'll have to register all those pages to make sure that they can be loaded for different URLs. But we're going to have a detailed look at this and at this URL and page concept in the next course section. But this is a file which we're definitely going to edit. And then, as I mentioned, we are also going to add our own custom files. But that is a rough overview over what we got here and why these different files matter. Now, last but not least, to conclude this course section here, I want to do two things. I want to start a development server, which allows us to preview the application we're working on. And I want to dive into one setup step, which we need for the next course section. Now let's start with the development server. So now we did create a new Django project with this command. And we also installed an IDE and configured it. Now, one step to really work on our project, which we haven't completed yet, is that we need to launch a local development server to preview and test our website. Now, I did mention that we have two files here, asgi.py and wsgi.py, which are related to serving our Python Django application. And that is true. But as long as we're developing, we want a little preview demo dummy web server which runs locally on our system and which allows us to preview the application we're working on. We don't want to finally host and serve the application yet, we just want to preview it. And for convenience, Django has a built-in development server, which makes that very, very easy. Now for this, we need to run a project-specific command, and as I mentioned in the last lecture, for that we're going to use the manage.py file. Now to run a command inside of this project in Visual Studio Code, I recommend that you go to Terminal here and open a new terminal. This exists on all operating systems. Now that is your default system terminal or command prompt already navigated into this project. And any commands which you execute here will run from inside this project folder. Now what we want to do here is we want to execute this manage.py file with a subcommand. Therefore, since this is a Python file, we write Python 3 manage.py and then run server. Run server is a built-in subcommand supported by Manage PY and Django, which will simply start such a preview development server for this project in this folder. So if I hit enter here, this now starts up a server which we can visit at this address, which is printed here. By default, it's your localhost IP address at a port of 8000. So we can go to our browser and either enter that IP :8000 or localhost :8000. Both works. And once you do that, you should see a starting page like this, which simply proves that the development server is up and running and you loaded your project successfully. Now, as we're working on our project and as we add our own pages, we will then be able to navigate to those pages and preview them here. It's not something we can do yet because we haven't created any pages yet, but soon we will be able to do so. Now, one very important note though, this development server, which we started with the run server command, is an ongoing process. As you can tell in this terminal, I'm not getting back control. I can't enter and execute more commands here. I can enter something here, but it's not treated as a new command. If you want to quit this running server, you need to press Ctrl+C here, and this will exit out of the server. But if you do so, you are no longer able to preview your application. If I reload localhost 8000, it now doesn't load this page anymore. Therefore, as long as you're working on the project, you should have that development server up and running. So here I will rerun this command. If you're then done for the day, you can quit it and restart it the next day when you continue working on this project. Now, therefore, I will keep this terminal open, up and running. I will just minimize it so that it doesn't occupy as much space. But it is important that this does stay up and running here. And with that, we got this development server, which we need to later preview our application. And therefore, we're almost done. I just want to do one last thing now to get started with Django and with our own code in the next course section. One side note, by the way, this SQLite free file, which was created here, is a little dummy database, which we're also going to use throughout the course, but which you can ignore for now. Now, to get started with Django and with our own code, there is one important Django concept which we need to understand. We got our Django project here, the My Page project. Inside of this My Page project folder, there is another My Page subfolder which contains some Python files. Now, Django projects embrace a modular structure. So a Django project often consists of multiple modules that make up the project. Now, in Django world, those modules are not called modules though, but apps. And you then do store your actual application code in those apps. So you don't really work in this main project subfolder which was created for you, but instead, to add different features to your entire project, you would add multiple apps that hold those features. And that might still sound very cryptic, so let's get there step by step. First, we want to create a new app in our Django project. And for this, we're again going to use this manage py file. And there, the start app subcommand, and then any name of our choice. In the next course section, I want to get started working on a challenges app, which allows us to set monthly challenges and view monthly challenges. Simply a simple basic app so that we can get started with Django. Therefore, what I'll do here is I will quit this running development server with Ctrl+C and then run Python, or in my case, since I have multiple Python versions installed, Python 3, manage py, start app, challenges. Run that inside of your entire Django project folder. And what this will do is it will create a new subfolder, challenges, which also contains a bunch of py files. And these are not the same files as we had before in my page. Now, before we analyze these Python files to understand what they're doing, I want to make sure that we fully understand what exactly Django apps are. Because we heard about Django projects, which we created with the Django admin command, and now we got apps. So what's the deal with that? We got our My Page Django project, and in that project folder, we also got another My Page folder, which for example has the project-wide settings in this settings py file. So this My Page folder inside of the created My Page project basically holds the project-wide configuration for this project. But then in addition to that project-wide configuration, we got individual apps, modules, we could say, which we add to this project, which combined make up this project. So when we build a website with Django, we create a project for this, and the entire project is our website, so to say, but the different features of this website. Let's say we're building a shop, so we got a feature for displaying products, and we got a feature for handling the cart and the checkout process. Those features would be represented by apps in this project to split our code and logic by feature into these different apps, into these different modules. That's the idea. So we, for example, created the Challenges app, but we could create more apps in one and the same project. So all these apps would coexist in this My Page project. And apps, therefore, simply are the building blocks that form this overall project. And we could translate the name app here with module. Since app sounds like a big standalone thing, it actually turns out that even a part of a bigger application could be an app in the Django world. And let me give you a couple of examples for this. Let's say you're building something like Google. If you think about Google, the website Google, then of course they have the Google search, but there also are Google Images, Google Maps, and many other Google products. And therefore we could say that the project is Google, but the apps which exist in this project are search, images, and maps. In the case of Amazon, we could have the shop, but then also Amazon Prime Video, Amazon Music, and that would be our separate apps. Now that's one way of looking at it. And if you would build your next Google or Amazon with Django, you would create a project named Google or Amazon, and in there you would have these apps named Images, Search, Maps, and so on. But that's of course for very large scale projects. We can also apply this idea of apps or modules to smaller projects. Let's say you build your own online shop. So like Amazon, but without video, music, and so on, just the shop. Now, this could be one big app, and you could create one app in one project if you're building this with Django. But to keep your code maintainable and maybe also reuse code with other projects, you alternatively could also create apps in your shop project where one app is about displaying products and product details to customers. Another app is for the shopping cart and the checkout process. And for administrating the products, you might have another app. So apps don't have to be those big standalone products which you could offer to your customers. An app in Django can also just be one small module of a bigger product, a bigger website you're building. And that's how you can also think about it. So here, for example, I have the Challenges app in my Page project. And then I could have another app, which is a shop and therefore totally unrelated to challenges. Or if my entire project is about challenges, then I could have the challenges app, and then another app which is for administrating the challenges, and then a third app which is for sharing the challenges. And those apps could be named admin and share. So it's really up to you how you want to structure this. It's just important to be aware of this concept of apps, which is where you do write your code in the end. And this concept exists so that you don't have one huge code base, but instead you have multiple smaller packages of code, which you can then combine together to one project. Now, for simple, small websites, this might look like an overkill, but of course, for bigger projects, this can be very useful. And with all of that out of the way, we got this challenges app in the My Page project now. And therefore now we're almost ready to start writing our own code. I just briefly want to walk over these folders and files that were created as part of this app. So we created the challenges app, and in this new challenges folder, which was then created automatically for us, we got a migrations folder and then a bunch of Python files. Now, the migrations folder is basically empty. It just has the empty init.py file, and we can ignore this folder for now. It will become important again later once we work with databases and models. But for the moment, we can ignore it. Now, we got another init.py file, which we can ignore. But now we got a couple of interesting files. We got an admin.py file, an apps.py file, models, tests, and views. Now, the admin.py file will also become important later once we start working with the built-in administration area. I got a separate module dedicated to that, so for the moment it does not matter. And apps.py also doesn't matter too much at the moment. One thing to note here, though, is that this basically configures this challenges app, this challenges module, which we created. And here it, for example, gives this a name. We could change this name, but by default it matches the folder name, and this name is needed later to identify this app when we, for example, want to connect multiple apps and so on. Other than that, we can also ignore that file though. The models.py file will become important once we start working with the database and we add data models to our project, so it will also become important later in a separate module. And the tests.py file will help us with automated testing and unit tests, something we're not doing here, so it also doesn't matter. Now, what will matter though is the views.py file. That's the file with which we're going to get started with in the next course section, because that is where we actually will write some logic for determining what we want to show to the users, to the visitors of our website. This is a super important file, and we are going to dive into this file and how to wire up this challenges app with our project and how to get started with our own code in the next course section.